A kind introduction and for the invitation to come here. It's great to see people in person again and not on screens. Even though I work with invertebrates, mostly flies, but also snails. And one may think, if one is not a biologist, one may think that we do not have much in common with flies and snails. It's still similar aspects that make flies, snails, and humans behave, namely internal aspects. And then they're guided by certain external influences. And so, of course, as a behavioral biologist, I also read outside of my little field, and I read a little bit of what, of course, makes humans change and make decisions. And so that has been just automatically when I've been thinking about how we can change how we can modernize our infrastructure. I've always been thinking about, okay, who would be likely to change their behavior, in what direction and why? And that has been a 15-year-long learning experience, even though, unfortunately, I was not in a position to do any of the kind of experiments that I do with flies. Maybe perhaps everybody else is pretty happy that they didn't get to be experimented upon as what I do in flies. So what I want to be talking about is, and what I will be talking about towards the end, but what I would like to be talking about for 45 minutes rather than just for the last couple, maybe 10 or so, is what, as a researcher, what I would like to have as an infrastructure. So what would help me doing research? I would want to have as little to do as possible with my texts, my data, my code, such that I can spend as much time as possible with my experiments, with designing new experiments, interpreting the data, thinking about my experiments, because every minute that I spend with other things just is lost from the things that I really want to do. However, what by now, after, sort of almost 30 years, so I started generating digital data in, I think, 1994 or 1995. And since then, not a whole lot has changed, neither for me, because I still write code and generate data, evaluate the data, and then write papers. So that has pretty much stayed the same for nearly 30 years now. But also the support that I've been getting from the various institutions that I've worked at also hasn't really changed dramatically in those 30 years. So that means that by now, with all those functionalities that we could have, that we wouldn't have been possible 30 years ago, departure from what we have now would be so radical that I feel I need to justify the reasons why we need to change and why we need to modernize, dramatically modernize the infrastructure now. 30 years in a digital cave do a lot of damage. If you don't, and not modernizing, not putting any money into keeping physical buildings up for 30 years also does a lot of damage. And the damage is not really, not to a major extent at least, that there are certain things in the infrastructure, in the content that we cannot access. The things that are really damaging and really dangerous are, so you need to switch something back because it worked before. And there's some weird thumps that are not my mic. So there you go. Good. Yes, now it's working. So our problems that we're facing that we think are now most dramatic is the reliability of the content that we put into our infrastructure, the affordability of the infrastructure, and the functionalities of the infrastructure. And so I think I need to quickly at least show you why we find that these three aspects are the ones that are most urgent compared to nearly everything else in this very long list. So this is like my personal top three. And I'll show you why I think those are the top three of a very long list of things that need to be changed. A few years ago, there was a paper that summarized different results on the prevalence of irreproducibility in the scientific literature. There were two papers published by Bayer Healthcare and Amgen that said that, well, we tried to replicate certain experiments and only 11% or only 22% we were able to replicate. That's dramatic, but that in turn itself is also not reliable because they don't want to tell anybody what they're researching on. And so we don't know which experiments they tried. So that's not very helpful. These 3 studies, you see the large sample sizes here, they looked at the methods section and said, well, reading from the methods section, only about half I could even think about reproducing in the lab. For all the others, there's not enough information in it. So that's bad enough. That's an indictment to the people who wrote the methods sections. But that doesn't mean that in principle you couldn't, with the help of the authors maybe, get the experiment going and find the same results. So that also is not very helpful. So what happened in 2012, well, it happened before, but it was published in 2012, was the first reproducibility project, and that was in psychology. And so there was quite, after this announcement, there was quite a lot of, or these announcements, there was a lot of anxiety. Where would it be? Would it be better than 50%, worse than 50%? And in this case, it turned out it was actually worse. Oops, it was actually worse. More than half of the experiments in this project could not be replicated. That's 10 years, that was published 10 years ago. So these issues were known a long time ago. They were starting to be addressed at this time. And so we knew that in psychology, it was more than 50% that was not replicable. And so the question is it just psychology, or how do the other fields look? And so you have social sciences, people looked at Science and Nature papers here. The base factor, everything larger than 1 is supposed to be saying, yes, the effect is there. Everything smaller than 1 says, no, the effect is not there. That was originally published. Here it looks a little bit better. 60% are replicable, but still that's around those 50%, which means that, you know, half of the literature is not reliable. In economics, there are different measures of how reproducible something was. There, if you pick one of those, it's about 60% again. So that's very similar. Now, something that's very close to where I work. I consider myself working in biology, biomedicine, broadly construed. And this is also what I teach. And so this is preclinical cancer research. This is the latest of the reproducibility projects that got published just recently. And here we have more information than for the other reproducibility projects. They picked 193 high-profile experiments. So that, again, that is high-profile journals with high-profile results that got a high profile because they're supposed to be groundbreaking and important. And then they looked at, was the data shared, analysis reported, code shared, reagents offered, protocol clarifications needed, authors helped, and so on. And everything that's red means something was wrong. And it meant that they could only, from those 193 that they picked, just about half, they could even start doing. So this confirmed all those previous studies that said only half of the experiments are actually thinkable to be reproduced because the methods section is written in a way that, and there are other aspects too, but one aspect is that the methods section is written in a way that you just cannot go to the bench and then pipette the things together and do the experiment. So that's 50% reproducibility that's gone right here, even before anybody has done anything on any experiment. Then they start 87 experiments, and then at the bench, they find out that 37 of them, they also cannot complete because something's missing, something's not working, there's information, something happens, reagents not shared, modifications needed, modifications implemented, and you see that you lose experiments such that out of those almost 200, 50% could complete, only 50% could be completed. And that's before you even find out how many of those actually turn out to be in the same direction as those published in the paper. And then you look what those 50 experiments are published in 23 papers. So it's about 2 experiments per paper. In total, these experiments yield 158 effects and a total of 188 outcomes. So that all depends on what it is, what you're analyzing. You can do one experiment, analyze several factors, right? Obviously, that's how you get these many outcomes. In total, if you take these 188 outcomes, you look at the original effect size published here, or plotted here, and each is one such outcome. And this is 0. And then you look at the replication effect size. So perfect replication, everything would be on this line. If the effect size would be bigger than the original, then they would be here. So this is 2, maybe 3 of those experiments. And if it's smaller, it's below that line. And you see that the effects that were found in the replication were overwhelmingly lower than the ones that were published. Many of them were non-significant. Some were significant, but in the opposite direction from where they were published. So in total, the success rate, and again, this is from 112 effects now that these authors considered this is what we can use for comparing or for assessing replicability, was 46%. So if you look at, you want to have a global picture, right? How many experiments get the same results, even if it's 3 results per experiment, I want all 3 of them to be there. If it's 46% of 50 experiments, then it's, let's say, whatever, 22 or something experiments. So that would mean if you take 22 experiments come out as described in the literature and you try 193, it means you're around 10%. That I would find dramatic. If I look at my own record of experiments and I picked 200 of my experiments and only 20 of them would be replicable, I should be looking for a different job. I don't know if I would, but I should. And so I certainly should. And the taxpayer has a right that we should be looking for different jobs. This is how we do our job. Now, as you can see, there is a boatload of different reasons why science is hard. There are different reasons why things don't replicate. So it's difficult to understand, to really say what kind of a replicability would you expect. But that is definitely lower than anything I would expect. That is for sure. And so since all of these things were published in high-ranking journals, one may assume that the rest of the literature, where purportedly peer review isn't as strict, would be even worse. It would mean that 10% is like the best we can do. Now that would be dramatic, because of course, everyone who has an itch to scratch with science or some other issue, they're going to use that, and they are using this already. Now I'm going to pick the example of the US because this is all well documented, but we know that also here in Europe, we have anti-scientific movements. We have some governments that are not very friendly to universities and public intellectuals and science in general. And in most democracies, these movements are ever only just an election cycle away from, if they're not in power now, they will be maybe 4 or 5 years from now. So I'm not just picking on the US to pick on the US. I'm holding it up as an example that this can happen anywhere in a democracy, and of course in places where democracy is not as strong as it is here. And so what happens? Well, if they're using reproducibility crisis as political ammunition, if Zika science is uncertain, do we really need government-funded research at all? And the person who said that then became Trump's director of Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney. And so, of course, when he says, why should we even fund science publicly? Let the rich people do that if they want to, as they did before. Then, of course, Trump was asking for massive cuts to science and medicine in both instances, seeks big cuts to science and funding. Again, this was stopped, but had he been a little bit more competent, it might have worked. And then the US would be in much bigger trouble than they already are. So the question then here is, and it is a dramatic question, how reliable is our journal rank? So can we use journal rank to pick the most reliable science? Then everything's fine. But if not, then we're just providing ammunition to these movements. And there it doesn't really look good. I'll go over 3 examples of a broad literature that essentially paints a very dire picture. What you see here is probably the closest to scientific quality that you can ever get as a number. That's from structural biology. Every little dot that you see here is a published computer model of a molecule, of a usually biological or chemical molecule. All molecules are chemical, but they're either important for chemistry or they're important for biology. The metric that you see here is essentially the deviation from a perfect model. So there are certain criteria, such as atomic distances and certain things that we know this molecule must adhere to. And if it doesn't, it means that the people who created the model made errors. And these things factor into this quality metric, such that the metric itself is a deviation from perfect. So the lower the metric is, the better the model was, or the better the people who constructed the model worked on this model. And then all of these dots were all averaged and set to the average was set to 0. So everything above 0 is better than average, and everything below 0, is worse than average. I'm sorry. So everything above 0 is worse than average, and everything below 0 is better than average. And what's marked here in colors and asterisks are those that are statistically significant, in this case, worse than average, in this case, better than average. And then what you find here is Cell, Science, Nature, EMBO Journal, PNAS, all of those are significantly worse than average. Now, you could say, and this is what the structural biologists say that I talk to, well, this is such a competitive field. And so in order to be the first ones who provide a structure, it doesn't have to be so perfect. It's okay if we have a rough structure. We just need to be quick. Now, that may be an explanation of this, but is it a good excuse for providing sloppy science and saying this is the best we can do? This is our good research? No, this is fast research. This is fast and sloppy research. Is that what we want? If that's what we want, well, maybe structural biology wants that, but let's look at other fields. So let's look at my field. That's neuroscience. Every single one of those dots is a neuroscientific experiment. What's plotted on this axis here, as you can see, is the impact factor in logarithmic scale. And then statistical power. Statistical power essentially is a measure of whether your sample size is big enough to be able to find the effects you're looking for. Convention has it that statistical power needs to be at 80%. You can see that very few people really care about this convention. Right? The convention is sort of like 80% statistical power and an alpha of 0.05, or like a 5% alpha value. So those are like the conventions that you usually should be able to keep. But very few people actually check, obviously, if 80% power is actually maintained. And so you see there's no relation whatsoever. So the high impact, or the studies in the high impact journals range from 0 to 100%, just as all the other journals. There's no effect whatsoever. The only difference here is, of course, that these people that worked so well here have less of a chance of getting a job than these people who essentially publish something that's most likely not reproducible. Again, a third example that's actually a funny one. Bioinformatics people, they often write complex algorithms that provide them with a list of genes that are involved in whatever it is they're studying. And so in order to provide readers of the paper that they want to publish with a list of genes that they can't really put into the text, they copy and paste the list of genes into an Excel spreadsheet and then submit it with the paper. And the thing is that very often they don't look at the Excel spreadsheet. And what happens is that the gene, for instance, the gene DEC10, Excel interprets it as a date and makes it 10th of December, 1664 or something crazy like that. The problem is so persistent that now the gene names of the human genes and of other genes that are being used in this are being changed. So DEC10 is not called DEC10 anymore, simply because it's easier to change gene names than it is to get people to look closely and prevent Excel from doing this. So how often does that happen? So of all the Excel files that the authors here studied, 20% on average had these problems. So 20% of the authors did not check their Excel spreadsheet that they submitted. And if you take, and these are different journals, and you can see there's a different fractions. Nature here is 30%. If you take the impact factor of those up here and average it, and compare it to those and average it, then it is higher above than below. So the high ranking journals, again, have more sloppy authors, at least, than the low ranking journals. So those are just three examples out of many. And there's only one example that I know that goes in the opposite direction, and that is about image duplications. So if someone put an image from a previous experiment or two different experiments in the same image. So these sorts of things are rarer in high impact journals, but essentially everything else that people ever looked at is worse in the top journals than in the others. And so what that means is that the high impact journals, that's what they want, right? They attract the most unreliable research, right? The old slogan of Nature was the world's best science. And if this is what you attract, then I would say it is highly unlikely that even a good peer review system would be able to catch all of that. So it's not surprising that the most unreliable research is published in the top journals. Adding insult to injury, the top journals don't even have a fully functioning peer review system, because most of the submitted articles isn't even peer reviewed, because there's some ex-scientist sitting there looking at the abstract saying that's not interesting, that's not interesting, that's not interesting. And so only a fraction of those gets even seen by peers. And if they're experts in the field, then of course they're biased because, oh, a Nature paper in my field, that's good because I can cite it in my next grant application. So there's a lot of bias in this process. So this process isn't even the best, it's not designed for it, it's not capable for it, and it's not even, of those different peer review systems that we have, it's not even the best suited to catch unreliable science. So it's no surprise that the data look the way they look. But what it means, of course, is that if we hire the people who publish in these journals, you don't have to be an evolutionary biologist to understand, if you do this for 30 years, and every time the literature just gets a little bit less reliable than the year before, those are not big effects. Everything you see here are not big effects. But you do this for 30 years, every little bit, it gets a percentage worse. And so you see then, of course, then what happens is the trajectory is clear. The literature gets less and less reliable, because that's what you select for. You punish meticulous scientists and you reward the sloppy ones. So that's a reliability, which I think is absolutely the worst problem. And you will see how it is related to other things than just this particular infrastructure. Clearly, journals are part of the infrastructure, and I hope I've tried to make the case that journals are dangerous and are bad for science. So for that reason alone, we should replace that infrastructure, but it gets worse. They're also very expensive. This is now an extreme example. Nature APCs have reached beyond 10,000 euros now, especially if you include tax. It's way beyond 10,000 euros. When, as another fairly extreme example, the costs to publish an article is actually just $200. If you take any of those, this is from Cielo, but if you take any of those publishers, then you find, and who would know this better than you people, publishing an article is not really very expensive. Now, let's look at average. Those were extremes. Let's look at some average prices that Alexander Grossman and I, who actually teaches this for a living, looked up. What do all these things actually cost? If you look on the market for these services, you buy them, put them together, what does that cost? And then you get scenarios from articles that have a lot of editorial work and very little editorial work, a lot of articles and very few articles per year. If you average all of this to some representative middle, then you find that it's about the prices we pay are around 4,000. So the prices vary, 4,000, 5,000. Let's take a charitable view for publishers, about 4,000 in income. Then they publish that about $1,200 is profits. Then this also very charitable, a whole $600 in publishing costs. This still means that for an average scholarly article, there's 2,200, more than half, that we pay where we don't really know where the money is going. And clearly this will be different for each journal, this will be different for each publisher, but this is an average chunk, on average, of all that, well, the 10, 15 billion that the globe is paying every year for these articles. More than 5 billion are going in places that have nothing to do with publishing. So where does that money go? Well, as Elizabeth Bick put it the other day on Twitter, late last year, would be nice if scientific publishers would be spending some of the millions of dollars we pay them on hiring staff to screen manuscripts for errors and fraud, and to quickly deal with concerns raised about published papers, like a decent quality control. Well, you've seen the data, that's definitely not where the money goes. So we know that, we know where it's not going, right? And there's a lot of other functionalities I'll be going into where we also see where it's not going. But what have we learned in the last 10 years where the money is going? Well, it's going into a technology that makes the journals read you. So while until about 10 years ago, you were reading the journals, now the journals are reading you. Because when you go, let's say here to Nature, and at one time from one place, you have 21 trackers that check what it is that you're doing when you're interacting with these papers, where you came from, where you're going, when you're leaving. On another time or another place, it's 34 of those trackers or 73. So we don't know why this changes. We've just noticed it. But what's going on behind the scenes at nature.com, we have no idea. Nobody knows. Well, they know, I would guess. This has become an issue that has been raised at a quite high profile. So you can read about data tracking and research, aggregation, use, and sale of usage data by academic publishers from the DFG, or you can read here from Jeff Pooley, Surveillance Publishing, that gives you a good impression of all the things that they collect about you and how they combine your professional reading and browsing with your private reading and browsing. If you use the same cell phone for private things, and you have it next to your computer, maybe in the same Wi-Fi network and the same university network, then this data can be combined. And so you can find bits and pieces of your professional life and your private life being intertwined on the servers of these publishers. Now, they use this, of course, to sell it. But because the nice thing is that if you sell something, it's not gone. If you sell something digital, you can sell a copy and still retain your own copy, so you can have dual use for every data. One of them is they're not just creating journals that read you. They're buying tools that read you, right? And this is, Hostbrink does that, Wiley does that, Elsevier, all the big publishers, they try to cover the entire workflow from discovery, analysis, writing, publication, outreach, and assessment. So it's clear that if Elsevier comes to your university and says, look, we have this open science suite for you, everything in one hand, just buy it, and we cover everything, that would be very hard to resist. For any university that says, well, we want to do open science, and here's an easy to use tool. And of course, once you're using this, it will be very, very hard after 3 years when you've gotten used to it to switch to a competition. So now we have monopolies here. This is what they want to have. They want to monopolize not just the publication sector, they want to monopolize the entire scientific workflow. That's where the money goes. And so they reverse effectively the flow of information. When before you were getting information from them, now we are providing information to these corporations. And that's the business model. And so they just stick with the cash cow journals for as long as they need to. And once that dries up, they have plenty of opportunities to just keep sucking us dry. So that's the affordability issue. That's where the money goes. We're funding the corporations that make sure that the reliability stays low, such that eventually, if we're in bad luck, all of science gets defunded. So that's why I'm saying we should defund the journals rather. But then, because the money goes into something else, it means we have trouble with functionalities, right? So this is just quality control, as I mentioned, is just one of the functionalities that they're not investing into. We know all of these things. I'm not going to read them all up. You can pick any one of those. But essentially, like I said, the functionality of journals hasn't really dramatically shifted in any way since the early days of the web. And when you think of all the things that you can do and how dynamic web content has become in the last 30 years, papers are still static as they've been in, I don't know, 30 years almost. But that's just one aspect, because papers is just one of our outputs, right? We produce data and code as well. So if you look at data, this is very old. This is from 11 years ago, but this is still pretty much the same. Most of the data is on our disks and in our drawers. All the data that I generate, that I've been generating since I have data from 1995. I'm procrastinating on finishing a paper where I show that I can still evaluate data from, what was it? I think that was from 1998, I think, where I can use the old data. I have to do some tricks and visualize, make a graph out of them. So I can still do this today, but it's on my drawer. Nobody else can do that. I'm the only one who can do that. Everybody else who from that time is either not in science anymore because they picked a different job or because they retired. So I'm literally the only person on the planet that can use data from that time. And there are no databases for this, right? There are no databases for this. And even those databases, right, that's the tip of the pyramid, but even that tip that's supposed to be very solid isn't, and it has never been. So SwissProt has existed for 10 years in 1996. So these databases have been around for 10 years since 1986, in 1996. And biology has about 1,300 such databases. So that's 1 out of 1,300, roughly. And they were in trouble because of funding. Now, this is an infrastructure you have to be aware. Without these databases, we cannot work. Like for us, I work for our fly work, we need Flybase. It's a database where everything about the fly genome is, for instance, and all the genes, everything, sequences, expression levels, all these things are there. Without this, we cannot work, right? You can stop subscribing to Elsevier for as long as you want, we can work fine. But if you stop this, we can go home because we cannot continue our work with access to these databases. And guess what is on infrastructure funding that gets renewed almost all the time? And what is on project funding? The things here, the 1,300 databases that are crucial for biology, without which most of biology would stop, they're on project funding. Such that, and this is not just in 1996, 2016, funding for key data resources in jeopardy. And then, of course, the consequences, the availability of research data declines rapidly with article age. So this is the problem that we've been facing since the 1980s, essentially, and it's still not fixed, is that things we really need to work are on project funds, and things that are really detrimental to science, journals, are still being funded regularly. How can it be that for 40 years, there's such a discrepancy in where we put our money? Why are we paying the things that are bad for science and the things that are good for science we're letting slip by the wayside? This is irrational. But it's even worse for code. This is one of the first machines that computers, the UNIVAC in 1953, where scientists developed code and shared it between each other. There haven't been, admittedly, a large user base. These things weren't really something you buy over the counter, but people have written code and have shared the code with each other. Since then, we have been doing this. There's no infrastructure, no institutional infrastructure that has been supporting us in sharing code since then, none. The thing that people, so there have been few websites, right, that people use, usually shared with professional coders from non-scientific fields. What people use today is GitHub. But GitHub was recently bought by Microsoft. And we know Microsoft has a habit of shutting down things that they don't think makes them enough money. We know that from their ebook store. If you have ever owned an ebook from Microsoft, you don't own it anymore because they just took it down and the books were gone. And so this has made it through the different news. The BBC says it, when it closes, your books will disappear too. The ebook apocalypse. Well, if they close GitHub, essentially 100% of scientific code is gone. It still resides on the local hard drives of the people, but if they retired or are no longer in science, it's gone. That's 100% of scientific content on the code side. No institutional infrastructure whatsoever. So we put a lot of money in something that's bad for science, and we put nearly nothing in the things that are really crucial for science, without which we cannot work. So now finally, about 10 minutes, as I said, 10, 15 minutes before the end. Now I've shown, I hope I've demonstrated why it was a disaster that we've waited for 30 years, because now all the functionalities that we need for text, data, and code, they would have to be implemented right now and in a very dramatically different way from 30 years ago. 30 years ago, it would have been an incremental change. But if you wait long enough, you have to tear the old building down and build a new one because you've let it rot. So how do we replace the rot? Well, this is what we pay today, roughly, between $4,000 and $5,000 for the content that we buy back. We know that publication services are much cheaper. So if we could find a way to have companies compete and exert price pressure, we would be able to bring it down, probably not to the cost level, because the companies need to survive too. If we want to have companies, there's a big discussion going on about this after. Anyway, if any for-profit company should be involved with this, but that's a separate issue. So if we would be able, just as we have in the non-digital infrastructure, right? We have competition between construction companies. And so if the building needs to be renovated, then we have a tender process and we take the lowest responsible bidder. We're forced to do that by procurement rules. If we had a similar thing, we could get very close to this value. And that would be about $9.56 billion US dollars per year that we could use to implement the new infrastructure that we so clearly need. I don't really know what $9 billion are. I don't know what they pay for. This is a number I don't know what to do with. So I looked up the two biggest experiments that I know that humanity has ever constructed, the International Space Station and the Large Hadron Collider in Geneva. And they run together construction and maintenance about 5 billion per year. So that's the kind of money we're currently spending on something that's actually hurting science. That's what, if it was only concerned, if we didn't have to build an infrastructure, right? But if we would only be concerned about publications, we could have 2 of these in addition with the money that we're currently wasting. Now, of course, I don't want that. What I want is, of course, is that money to stay where it is now, which is mainly libraries to a large extent, not exclusively, but mainly, and to be used for the kind of infrastructure that does the things that I was talking about in the beginning. So what are the obstacles? The obstacles are, of course, on our end as a researcher, that we cannot decide to just abandon journals because that would risk the career. So I can do that. So, but I rarely write papers alone. I have colleagues and mostly undergraduates and graduate students, and they decide where we publish. I advise them, but I stay completely out where we publish. The people who need journal rank for their careers, they decide where we publish. I stay out. And so the issue is rather, where does the money go? Because I'm not directly paying. It's our institutions that are paying via subscriptions and APCs. And on the subscription side, it's quite clear why does so much money go there, because each journal is a monopoly and each article is a monopoly, so they can charge what they want. And this is very well known. This is from 2003 from the European Commission about a merger. Then they look at the market and they do market assessment, and what they say is, from the point of view of functional interchangeability, 2 different publications could hardly be regarded as substitutable by the end users, the readers, which is, I have learned now in the last few years, which is lawyers speak for, it's a monopoly. So the EU, the European Commission, has known for a very long time, for 20 years, even longer probably, I don't know if this is the oldest document, that these journals, these publishers are monopolists. And this is something that very recently, now in January, the German Wissenschaftsrat, the Council for Science and Humanities, that's the government instituted advisory committee to the scientific advisory committee to the government. So where the government sends people and then appoint scientists, where they meet and they do these assessments about the transformation of academic publishing towards open access. And what they also say, that it's essentially the same thing: functioning competition-driven market structures do not exist due to this concentration in the case of journals and the non-substitutability of journal titles and that sort of thing. So this is something that is well established. That is the problem. This needs to be fixed. So how do people think this could be fixed? Now, well, so this is the summary, right? Current journal payments for content allowed only via single source exemptions, right? Because if it's non-substitutable, then you can pay for it in a negotiation, because otherwise you would have to hold a tender if there would be competition or substitution possibilities. So what they say here, and this is something one hears not just from there, this is just an example. This is a prerequisite for making publication options substitutable, and thus for enabling competition between publication service providers. So here the point is that the goal of this perspective on transformative agreements is actually to make publication services substitutable. And so one can argue that to the extent that these transformations make publishers substitutable or publication services substitutable, they will be successful. To the extent where this becomes again non-substitutable, then what's the point? Then the problem was not solved. So then they clearly failed. So I think this paper here, I have a lot to criticize about this document, but what it, I think, accurately pointed towards is that now we have a criterion by which we can judge the success or failure of transformative agreement. If transformative agreements doesn't lead to substitutability, they failed. And if it leads that way, they have succeeded. Because what then happens, if that they become substitutable, you can launch tenders. Here, the European Commission has done that because they know that if they play into the old game of, oh, I want to publish something here or there, then there's no market. And so when they needed publication services, just like we need publication services, there's only historical difference. They need publication services, we need publication services. The only reason I publish in journals is historical. And so they picked the reasonable way of doing it, and they hosted a tender. And we all know this led to the construction of Open Research Europe, so far powered by F1000 Research, but the contract lasts for another 3 years, and they could pick a different service provider after those 3 years, in principle. So this means that we must ensure that publishing services cannot be covered by the single source exemption, but must be awarded by tender or bidding processes, as we've shown Open Research Europe does, and as we, of course, all public institutions must do for everything else that's not a digital infrastructure, right? So what I'm saying is we must lobby regulatory bodies, the ministries that oversee our institutions, our purchasing departments, to make sure that they clamp down hard on negotiations with monopolists. Public money must not be spent on monopolists. There must be a ban on spending public monies on these kind of monopolist corporations. So that's something that we can do within our institutions, and that we as members of the public can ask from our regulatory bodies. It's our tax money that's being wasted. So we should demand that. So how could we use that to replace the journals? Open Research Europe is part of ORC, Open Research Central. All kinds of institutions have their platforms, and you hook them up together, and you have one place where you can find all the literature. It's quite clear that if every institution would do that, if CORE would do that with everybody else, like CORE, then there's no need for Sci-Hub or anything like that, because that would cover the entire literature. So that is a journal replacement for reading right there. And if it's combined with an authoring system where I, as an author, just write my paper and then click publish and I'm done with it, this saved me a ton of work. And every author on this planet, all the 12 million authors on this planet. And so for both for readers and for authors, it's a replacement right there. And if institutions would start to not fund the old system and just fund the new system, then researchers would have the choice of paying for something that's slow and cumbersome, and that many institutions would be very publicly opposed against. So essentially they would stop getting jobs at these places, and something that would be quick, easy, and free. And so you can be sure that few people will choose to pay out of their pocket for something that in many institutions isn't even valued anymore. So what that would then mean is from that we could build and implement, I'm almost done, a sustainable scholarly infrastructure. If we have substitutable services, we have competition, costs, prices drop. There would be no author-facing costs. Anything that the journals can do that we like to keep, we just copy because it's a digital functionality. We would have cost-neutral solutions. We would add money for data and code. No individual mandates were necessary. Just, if people still, that's like now, like with books in my field, if I want to publish a book, well, I pay for it. That's just, that's how it is. The university doesn't pay for that because we publish in journals and that they pay for that. No, and if the journals don't have any money anymore, they stop existing. And if the journals don't exist anymore, you don't have to wonder about journal quality, and you don't have to ask people, oh, where's your Nature paper so I can hire you? If Nature doesn't exist, it's silly to ask for a Nature paper. So we solve a whole host of issues. All the first 20 minutes or 25 minutes that I talked about journal quality is all gone immediately if we do that. And the side effect, of course, we get access, but there's a lot of other things that come before access. So essentially, what we could create from that is a system of interoperable digital research objects. There are dynamic and version controlled, can be searched in text mines, near immediate publication, as I just hit publish. Different models for post-publication review already exist, as we've known since 2016 at the latest. There's all kinds of ways how we can then assess the reliability. So we have layered ways of assessing reliability, such that the things that are the most outrageous claims, can be subjected to the most stringent and most critical scrutiny. We have contributorship in diverse roles, which means we don't have to fire people and kick them out of science who can't write papers, but are really good at writing code. We can reward them for writing good code, and which is something we cannot do now. And it's open to everyone in principle. So all of these things then can be put into what one could call the heliocentric model of our infrastructure, where the scientific process actually sits in the center and not the paper. And all these other things revolve around it. And we can support the scientific process. And so we do science because of science and not because of a publication. So we can put it back to how it was when you ask undergraduates, why did you start science? It's not that they said, so why did you start studying science? They don't say, because I want to publish in Nature. It's because I'm really interested in something. If you ask a postdoc, what's your goal? It's to publish in Nature. So things change from being an undergraduate to being a postdoc. And that we can put back to where it should be. How can we make sure that the money we save, that's something every one of you is probably also familiar with, actually stays where it is now, right? Because university leaderships will be just too keen on getting all the money that you're not spending on subscriptions and APCs and put it somewhere else. But we want to put it in better infrastructure. By we, I mean every one of us, the users especially, because that's what we profit from. And each and every, and here I looked at the Coalition S members of the different funders, and I checked out what policies they have with regard to who they give money to. And they don't just give out money to willy-nilly. And the NSF, a friend of mine who works there, told me that, no, Trump University need not apply. So not every institution is eligible to receive funding by those, for instance, Coalition S funders, and it's the same in the US and in many other places. There are prerequisites. You have to have some form of basic infrastructure to be able to be eligible for research funds. And so, of course, what should be done is, and funders are part of our community. As researchers, we interact with the funders all the time. We send people there, we review for them. This is inside, funders are inside of the community. You know, some of my colleagues often like to portray them as the ones that urge them to do certain things, but that's rarely, or only partially the case. So we need to influence our funders to make sure that institutions that do not redirect the funds to modern infrastructure that covers text, data, and code are no longer eligible for funding. Right now, they look at, oh, you have to be able to provide computers and so many staff. And in fact, for my funder, or for our funder in Germany, the DFG, there have been prerequisites for a data infrastructure and code infrastructure for more than 10 years. They're just not enforced. So in many cases, these eligibility criteria are already in place that would force institutions to implement a modern infrastructure that just no consequences if they don't. So in many cases, it's just enforcement that matters. And so the two things that I want to conclude here with, 5 minutes over time, sorry, is that enforce procurement rules once substitutability is established. Publication payments can only be awarded exclusively via tenders. Everything else, each institution can solve for themselves and provide the services that their faculty find most useful. And the other is that funding agencies can incentivize institutions to make investments in modern infrastructure via their eligibility rules. If you have antiquated infrastructure or invest your money in antiquated infrastructure, maybe even anti-scientific infrastructure, counterproductive infrastructure, no funding. Why should public money go towards an institution that supports counterproductive corporations? I think those are easy to justify measures, and they help to shift the funds away from the counterproductive journal system and towards the infrastructure that we as the users need and that everybody else needs, because what's good for science is essentially good for society. And so this pushes the funding away from the journals, and this pushes the funding towards the infrastructure. And I would say, and this is how I would conclude, if the journals survive, our infrastructure will die. And so if the journals, the goal must be to replace the journals must go. As long as the journals are there, all our efforts to construct an alternative infrastructure will be in vain and will falter and die. Thank you.
Now, I'm wondering if you could put up the Zoom picture instead of the Bjorn, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation, and I think your vision is very much aligned with the core vision. As a matter of fact, today is really a strategic thinking day for us, and you've given us a lot to consider. And I hope you're going to be able to participate in the rest of the discussions today.
I'll try, thank you.
Yeah. So I'm wondering. By the way, Bjorn, you may be interested that we announced yesterday that we will be receiving $4 million for our Core Notify project, which is creating a distributed ecosystem that will link repository resources with peer review and assessment services. So I think it's one big step towards trying to actualize the vision that you're talking about.
Time to celebrate.
Yeah, so it's time to celebrate. But we're asking people not to tweet about it until we have the press release officially ready to go, which should be this week. So maybe I will open the floor to questions. I see Paul has his hand raised. Paul, I think you're going to have to come up here to the mic.
So thank you very much for that. That was a really interesting presentation. I'm completely on board with your vision. I was
so in this.
Well, yeah, I was particularly interested in the strategy of using the substitutability aspect and sort of the antitrust kind of approach. And that's given me much food for thought. I think one of the issues here is that there's another powerful voice which doesn't really get expressed in these discussions. It's sort of implicit, which is you alluded to the postdocs. So the people who have bought into the system and who then represent the majority of professional researchers, they have a powerful voice, which is, I think, sort of indirect, but it's there in the discussion nonetheless. And their voice is for maintaining this status quo, because that's the career progression that they have. So we sort of had your ideas about how the funders can change things, but I wonder about those people that have somehow gone from centering the scientific method to centering the journal.
Yeah, no, that's a very good. That's a very good point, and the situation here is that what is hardest to reach are the search committees that employ researchers. This is where it's most difficult to reach. That's the most informal area, right? There are no fixed rules, and where there are fixed rules, they're different from faculty from department to department in an institution, and from institution to institution, from country to country. So this is the most difficult to reach part. This is also why there's no point in just, we just stop using the impact factor or something like this, because the journals are still around, and it's still going to be, oh, that person got a Nature paper and the other person didn't, and so we hire her. That's always going to be the case. So that's the most difficult part. And that's why I'm saying there is no other way, because this will always be in people's heads, and you cannot reach into people's heads. People always talk about hearts and minds, but it's not going to happen. And so if you ever try to get two academics to agree on something, and you'll probably find how impossible it is to get 12 million of them to agree on something. So I don't see any other way than to really make the journals physically go away. Now, some of the major ones that started as sort of review journals like Nature, they were just like Scientific American or that sort of thing. they may go back to that. And there's, of course, this is about original research. If they publish whatever else review articles or something they publish, that's fine. That's not an issue. I would even argue that subscriptions are actually a good model for that sort of thing. Because if you have a general audience, every reader just is fewer than every author. And so subscription actually makes sense financially for a lot of reasons. But as long as they exist as primary research outlets, the only thing how you can take this anxiety away, and this is what it is, it's anxiety-fueled preference. It's not that they, I would, it would be interesting if one could ever get an honest opinion poll about these things together. I doubt it, but I would say that very few actually like Nature and Science and these journals because they're great journals. It's really just because they like them because they're vehicles for their career progression. So they need to go away. And so defunding them, and ideally with a bang in the beginning, sets a very prominent signal that the time of these journals is over. You will not get every one of them, that's for sure. But you should be able to at least get enough of them that not everyone is screaming, oh, but my career. But some will be saying, no, 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 don't worry, we've got you covered. And then this will reduce that voice, because right now, and that, I mean, that voice that you were probably alluding to that voice that came when Plan S was announced, right? And that's for sure, because Plan S, essentially what Plan is, if you look at it from the perspective of a postdoc, is every institution says I must publish in these journals, but my funder says, well, wants to say, no, you have to publish somewhere else. And so which rules am I going to break? And it's quite obvious that this is, it is insane to even think about mandates on authors. They don't have the money. They're the weakest link. They have the least power. So of course they will object. Because the mental health issues among those junior academics, early career researchers are through the roof. And one reason is that they get mandates that go in opposite directions. How are they supposed to fulfill mandates that go into opposite directions? It's insane. And so if the mandates all go in the same directions, there's no cognitive dissonance. And so resistance will be less. And so one could also summarize it not in just 2 points, one could summarize in 1 point. Let's make rational science policy. Science policy goes in one direction. It benefits science and seeks to align the incentives for science, society, and the scientist. If you do that, there will be much less resistance. That's essentially what our plan should be.
Yeah, and I think we see with transformative agreements, things moving in some ways in the opposite direction of what you're proposing, because these agreements are, locking institutions into those journals. And certainly at CORE, we are an international association. We're very aware that transformative agreements do not work. APCs do not work in many countries. Okay. So I'm going to read a couple of comments in the chat. Bianca has a question, and then we have one question online from Andras. So I just thought you'd be interested to read your, Ale says, too good, this keynote.
Don't say that. Goes to my head.
Ginny Barber says, great talk, many thanks. Arun, who will be giving a presentation later, says, yes, journals should go away. Scientists should exchange knowledge through preprints. And Andres said, congratulations, excellent talk. So Andres, I'm going to turn it over to...
Did anyone put a negative comment in?
No, not yet.
See, nobody, there's no point in reading the positive ones if they're,
so
nobody dares to put negatives there.
Yeah, I'm going to turn it over to Bianca now, and then Andres will take your question online. So Bianca? Okay, and there's another question over here.
Thank you, Kathleen. Well, another positive comment. Sorry, but it was a fantastic presentation. And I would like to say, don't you think that it's time to rethink about the concept of the journals? What is the importance of the journals because we have another instruments like repositories that could be a substitute of journals, because I think that's the most important thing is present and spread the results of scientific. And I think that it could be very important to rethink about the importance of the journals. And I'd like to say that transformative agreements does not work for the Latin American region. We don't have funds to support all our researchers. And thank you again.
Of course, thank you. No, I mean, it's clear that transformative agreements have a hard time establishing substitutability. Because if they just transform the journals as they are today into a different payment system, which is likely to happen. I know the people who work in transformative agreements would like to disagree, but that's the way it looks for now, at least. This may change. If we're lucky, the people who are working in transformative agreements are competent and know more than they let on now. And so let's be optimistic. But if that doesn't happen, then clearly things will be worse than they are now, right? Because the mantra is publish or perish and not read or rot. And so the one thing that made subscriptions so bad was that there was no alternative, right? That's the point. So, and people were afraid, oh, my faculty can't read, so I must pay what they ask. But what's worse than not being able to read, not being able to publish? So, and everyone, as our librarian, one of our librarians keeps like telling me is that when I announce a subscription cancellation, everybody says, I have to stop working when you do that. And then he cancels and nothing happens. So that's about, that's how bad reading was perceived to be, but it wasn't. Now, publishing, not being able to publish is going to be much worse than the announcements that they cannot work. If you have a working publishing agreement, and which means that that the authors would overnight have to pay and you cancel it without anything else, that would mean that for a Nature paper, the authors would pay out of their pocket 10,000 euros in order to stay in science. There would be torches and pitchforks in front of the library that would do that. So the consequences of canceling such big open access deals would be much, much worse than the consequences of canceling a subscription. So if the transformative agreements just move smoothly big subscription deals into big OA deals, things are going to get a lot worse. I think that's very clear and obvious. So what is the importance of journals? What are journals good for, right? So I put, that was a question. What functionality would we copy from journals? That varies dramatically from field to field. So for some fields, journals really constitute a community. But I think everyone's aware of much, much more efficient ways of organizing community these days. I think everyone has at least heard of social media. So social technology, I would argue, is a lot more efficient than a journal from 1665 in organizing communities. And then for my field, for instance, the communities don't exist on journals. Communities for my field, this varies dramatically, as I said, are usually conferences and the topic of the research. We publish our papers all over the place. And it's essentially, if it's in PubMed, then people will read it, and it doesn't matter where we publish for our readership, for our community, we will see each other's papers anyway. And we see each other and if we miss a paper, we see each other at a conference and we talk about it and we give a presentation. Most of the time, we'll see the results before they come out anyway. I read very few papers that are immediately in my field because I read the title and said, hey, I saw this guy presenting this a year ago. So there isn't a lot left that the journals are still doing for us. And what is left is very specific to subfields. If you just look at scholarship in general, there's very little left that the journals actually do that has a function that one would copy. And of those few things, one would just use a different technology today to implement that functionality. That's what I would, from my perspective. But that's, biomedicine, natural sciences. This is very different if you go to the humanities, for instance.
Thanks. Bjorn, okay, I'm gonna go to Andres now, and then we'll go to the questions in the room, but we're gonna go to Andres now, who's online. Andres, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, mine is a comment. I'm going to talk this afternoon, and
Can you speak up a little bit, Andres? Can you turn your volume up?
I try. Just a second.
Yeah.
Is it any better?
Yes.
Can you hear him? Okay, well, you're better. So go ahead, Andres.
It will be a comment. I'm going to speak this afternoon, but I'm tempted to use some of my arguments right now. And my point is, how do we increase the visibility of our community services like repositories? And my idea is that we should use journals till we don't shut them down. What I mean is that we should put our code or data or auxiliary material to repositories. We give them PIDs, and we refer them in our articles we publish in journals. We link them to articles. And I think that's a great way to increase the visibility of those repositories. If you write a Nature article, put there a lot of links to repositories, to community services via PIDs, DOIs, and other things. And I think that would help increasing the visibility for those repositories. Thank you.
Yeah, so I thank you very much. That's an excellent segue. I shook my head initially because as an endpoint, this would not be a desirable endpoint, but as a stepping stone, yes. So what we're doing currently, and what I should have published already, but I didn't get around to it, is we're trying to develop a little system that would be very helpful for us, that could showcase how things could work in the future. So as I said, we generate digital data. That's what most people do these days in various ways. And we generate the data together with the metadata right away. So our experiments are computerized, which means that they must have the metadata, because otherwise I cannot evaluate the raw data, right? I need to tell the computer which file is which goes into the experimental group, which goes into the control group. All of these things, they need to be in digital format because our evaluation scripts expect them. Which means that what you can do is, because all of this is machine readable, what we have done with our library is we set up a little Python script that is executed every time the user logs in, and then checks if the data and the metadata, all of this is in one folder in this case, on the publication server is in sync with the local drive. And if it isn't, then it syncs it. And it does it in a way because it reads some of the metadata, and it reads general metadata like the name of the person, like the username, and maybe the title of the experiment. This is usually something that's very unambiguous, and then publishes it right away. And so whenever the user logs in, if it doesn't exist, it's created the entry, and if it needs updating, it's updating. So it's automatically published. And then the evaluations that sit in the same folder, their evaluations are in HTML, and these are for each individual file. It's a long list of quality control evaluations, and then there's a central document where all the evaluations for the entire data set are included. And the point of this exercise is that this is always online all the time. So anyone can follow just by checking out the HTML documents with a browser, can check on the progress of this data set. But in the end, and they sit with our library, and so this is pretty much how Andres said it would happen. But it's not, the idea here is not to just use links. So we generate publication-ready figures. So the point of all of this is, in the end, to find a place, someone, something, where we just take the publication-ready figures. So let's say we have 10 figures in this central document of this data set. And the one evaluation that shows the effect that we've tested, we just drag and drop into our authoring system. Via this drag and drop, we create the link to the PID is created automatically. So we do not have to deposit anything anywhere because our script does that. We do not have to put links to any PIDs manually where we could make mistakes. We just drag and drop the figure such that when I hit publish, the reader can go via that figure to the central document, look at all the other evaluations that we've made, look at different angles of the experiment to see whether we missed something or intentionally left something out to make the data look better than it actually is. Link through the links in there, click through to the raw data, to the quality control data, and because each raw data file contains links to the software that was used to create the data and the software that we used to create those HTML evaluation files, everything is linked together. And the user doesn't have to do anything. All we have to do is we have to create this once. And a bachelor student can use that very easily. They just enter their name and then log in with their Python script to the publication server, and things happen automatically. They don't have to do anything. So that's what is an example of how I would envision this infrastructure to be. I just sit down on my computer, and on my computer, the infrastructure is provided that provides me with these functionalities that I don't have to worry about. And now this may sound very complicated, but it really isn't, because it's sort of, the concept is the same as with email, right? Does any one of you know what software is running on the email server of your institution? Probably not. And it can switch. You don't know about that because you get most of the times you get your access credentials, and then you use whatever interface you want to use. And in most cases, be it email or something else, in most cases, you use what comes on the computer you get from your computing center. So what I would also subsume, and this concludes this long monologue, what I would also subsume under infrastructure is that it comes on your computer. So just if you come to an institution, they give you login credentials for all the different functionalities. And so when you come to an institution, they tell you, this is where you put your code, this is where you put your data. You just have to, once initialize this, and then we take care of everything else. Once it's initialized, it runs in the background. You flip on a switch, light comes on, you turn the faucet, water comes out. You start up your computer, data and code is taken care of. That's what I, from a user perspective, would call a digital infrastructure. It takes work away from me and automates things, and the more things are automated, less mistakes I can make. And so, yes, I think it's a good idea, but you would have to get the corporations to put money where in the last 20 years they haven't put any money in. That is to improve the functionality of their journals. You would have to let them use authoring systems. You would have to let them link automatically back to these repositories. If they still want everything to be sent to them in PDF, then that's not going to work.
Okay, thanks, Bjorn. So we've got 3 questions in the audience. Ramiro, Eloy, Pandelis. Then we have a question by Ginny and Irina, and I think we better close it after that.
I'll try to be shorter now.
Ramiro?
Thank you. Thank you. Enjoy your talk. I come from the US, University of New Mexico. And I'm glad you touched something from the US, right? We had a president that selected a Secretary of Energy that wanted to shut down the Department of Energy. That means the 17 national labs would have been shut down. Los Alamos and all that. I like your talk, and I see the rich getting richer again. And it's more of a, and there's a lot of ethics involved. How do you connect this with university rankings, which is very, very, very crucial for, because everybody's ranking these universities. People don't know how they are ranked, first of all. Okay, there's a lot of secrecy behind that. But your topic is really well connected with rankings. Thank you.
Okay, don't get me started. And so, I mean, I tried to explain what my position is with regard to journal ranking. Now, I'm fairly certain that the data don't look much better with regard to institutional rankings. So very likely also there's very little empirical support for any ranking positions. I think a colleague of ours, he was, I'm blanking on his name. He was university president at several universities in Switzerland. I think now he's in Germany, another university. At one of those Science Council for Science and Humanities, this government organization that I mentioned. At one of these events, we sat on a podium together, and he said that the root, or one of the roots of the problem, can be exemplified by a German university that hired 2 full-time equivalents to get their data up to speed such that they would climb in the rankings. They managed to climb 100 positions, not by changing anything at the university, but just by changing the data, the way they submit the data to the ranking organizations. And so if your university is more willing to put money into looking good rather into actually being good, right? So if academia has deteriorated to the extent that show goes over substance to such an extent that people are willing to put more money into show than they are willing to put into substance, then we clearly have a much larger issue at hand. So what I explained today essentially presupposes good actors, right? So it presupposes that, maybe naively, it presupposes that everyone has, in principle, the good of science and scholarship in general at heart. And it's just the differences in motivations, the differences in perspectives, and differences in education and training that sometimes lead to unintended consequences. If, however, I am wrong in this, and that universities or public institutions are run by people for completely other motivations, personal motivations, ambition, then I think the problem lies elsewhere. If there's maybe one aspect, if funders decide to make certain institutions ineligible for funding because they have inadequate infrastructure, I would say that that must certainly have an effect on some aspects of ranking, because ranking also includes research funding. And if an institution is not funded by particular funders anymore because they slipped down infrastructure, that must have a knock-on effect at some point. But I would tend to hope that my naive view is hopefully maybe more realistic, but I'm willing to concede that I'm too naive. Maybe, hopefully not.
Thank you, Bjorn. Eloy.
So thanks a lot, Björn. Again, I will agree and congratulate you for your talk. Just one comment and then also a comment and question regarding the transformative agreements. Still, I really think that the problem that they are not transformative. The question is that they keep probably all the problems that you mentioned. So they keep the same players, the same journal brands, the same fetish with the journal brand, and just shift the payment from one point to another, and probably everything else rests the same. And I think this is a part of the problem of affordability on the south of the world, etc. This is the main problem. The second thing that I want to touch upon is I see your point, and I agree with it. If of a kind of a funder ban to institutions that don't have the proper infrastructure, but again, realistically, I hope I'm wrong. I don't see it happen, at least on the short term, because they can do it, for instance, for the funding, for the central funding of research infrastructures. But then there's a lot of funding that goes to research projects, and yes. and those funding is also now supporting the payment of APCs, etc. So I see the role of funders very important. For instance, like establishing Open Research Europe, and other founders should also provide some journal agnostic publishing platforms. And I see also your point, but do you think realistically that we can expect funders to do that step? Because otherwise, and that's I think our big challenge, is that we need institutions need to have other incentives to make that move. Because I totally agree that we need to make that move to sustain our own infrastructure. Thank you.
All right, that should be a question I hopefully could answer more quickly. Thank you very much. I'm not a prophet. I don't know what's going to happen, but I have these eligibility criteria actually affect all research funds, also the individual funds. It means that, so for in our case, if our institution would not sign up, there's a new codex, that's how they call it, a codex of good scientific practice. If our institution does not sign up in a legally binding manner to these new rules that incorporate, by the way, 10 years of data protection, right? Of research data protection, for instance, right? So they are updated. They have, these rules are being updated. If our university does not implement them in a legally binding way, there is no more research funds for me. I cannot apply. If I sit at an institution that does not have a legally binding contract with this with these rules, that does not implement them actually into their statutes, I cannot apply. And so that's what I mean, is that institutions and their members cannot apply. Now, that means that, so this is a dramatic incentive, because all faculty depend on this. And if university leadership doesn't implement this, then all hell breaks loose at that institution, I can tell you. So this is a very, very sharp sword. And this may sound really unrealistic, but Mark Schiltz, one of the designers of Plan S, said, when I confronted him with this idea, he said, yes, it's difficult, but it's doable in principle. And actually, a short version of our proposal to do just that was published on the Coalition S blog. So I would think that at least, I would hope, that at least they're thinking about this. And what you can do, precisely because they have these, they started with Plan S, these individual mandates. What everyone can do is ask them, why do you go after the weakest and let the richest go off chalk-free? Why? Why do you let them get away? So if you really want what you write in Plan S, we want to have access and we want to have open science and all of these things, if this is not just lip service and you just big talk, why don't you do the things that actually work? And so there is a possibility, because they've written, this is all there, they've written this. You can't take them by their word and say, look, if you really mean it, do something, do it, and it will help. So I'm not a prophet, so I don't know if it's going to happen, but they said it's possible. I've asked, Mark Schiltz is not the only one that said, yes, this is of course, the way these criteria are being made and written is different for every funder. So for some, it may be get two people there and write them new. And for others, it may be a 10-year process where you have to involve all kinds of researchers and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, those are the extremes. So it may be more easy for others and more difficult for a different funder, but they all say it's doable. And at least it's on their radar because they put it on their own outlet. So if they then decide it's too difficult, then one can say, well, apparently it wasn't a difficult enough problem, right? If they say, no, changing the eligibility criteria is too much work, well, it's a cost-benefit analysis, right? If it's too much work, well, then probably the priorities are somewhere else. And then we know where funder priorities are. They're not with the reliability of the research that they fund, quite obviously. And that's the consequence.
Yeah, I think there are, as you say, precedents to that. I know in Canada, the funders have asked the universities to adopt research data management strategies. And at some point they will say, we will not fund your researchers unless they're at an institution with one of those.
That is an excellent keyword, actually.
Strategies. Yeah.
I mean, essentially what my whole talk today, to a large extent, was about that I want to put, if my funder asks me for a research data management plan, I would say, I use the infrastructure of my university. They take care of that, right? That's how it should be. Thanks for that keyword. That's exactly it, right? And so in that way, right, these research data management plans put the onus again on the researchers. But the onus has to be put on the institutions, right? It's like saying the funder is like saying, okay, you have to show that you actually have electricity in your lab, right? The research data management plan is analogous to writing, okay, how are you going to get electricity and water and gas into your lab, right? That's the equivalent. And we don't find it absurd for research data, because research data is, for those who have not been generating them since the 1990s, something fairly new, right? But it would be very weird to read something about an electricity management plan. But that's just historical. That's just historical because they have been providing this for such a long time. If institutions would have provided infrastructure for our research data, funders would not put that in their requirements either.
Okay, Pandelis is next, and then Ginny will come to you after Pandelis, and then Irina. Uh-oh.
Thank you, Björn, for your talk. No negative comments, I'm afraid. Sorry about that.
Preaching to the choir.
Just a question for you, and then maybe something to discuss or think about for the rest of the audience. So I used to think like you get that there are no good journals and they should just disappear, and that would be the best case scenario. But yesterday, right here, I presented a different kind of journal together with Isabel, which is but just very briefly that it was a traditional journal. It had all the reputation structure like impact factor and all that, which is important still for researchers, but we just kicked out the publisher, and instead we're publishing everything in the repository. So the articles starting from the preprints, and then the post peer review versions, and of course the peer reviews themselves. So everything is lives in the repository. So I would say that if I had to think of how to define a good journal, because we heard in the future about like PLOS once was a good journal, then so I think a definition would be not to own anything. So what we are as a journal, what the journal is now, is just a group of people who like try to facilitate a community. Exactly.
So you generated social media.
Yeah.
Right. It's not a journal.
It's
what you have is a community in social media.
Yes, we have some structure that is more presential. So we do have the meetings, the society, and all that.
Which is what I want.
Which is
which is exactly what I said.
Helpful. Yeah.
You're just still calling it a journal.
Yeah.
We still call this a smartphone.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
How often do you use it for phoning?
So I think
Right.
I think that maybe there's a I'm still sticking with the term of journal because it's familiar to researchers. So on the side of the researchers, because this was the other problem, how do you convince researchers to do something differently, right? In our case, we don't have to discuss about that because they still go to their journal that they trust, and they know that it has, these are the people behind the journal, this is the impact factor that the journal has. So They
Yeah.
don't have to. They don't have to do something different. So
No, but we have to destroy the journals, but we can still call the replacement journals if we want.
why don't we call?
You know, it's like preprints. Like nothing ever gets printed, and we still call them preprints. I mean, that's the absurdest thing ever.
Why don't we call them publishers? Because for me, what you call a journal is the publisher, is the entity that owns the resource.
Yes, but I mean, I remember before when I was a postdoc, before I started to looking into this stuff, I had no idea who the publishers are. I only knew the journals. I didn't know about the publishers. They were way behind the scenes. Sometimes I could see, well, at meetings, you know, I could see publisher stands, but that's because they had their journal names there. Otherwise, I would not have noticed. The publishers are, they're not. I mean, they're like, if journals are like referees in a soccer game, publishers are like the referee organization that nobody even knows the name of.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So yes, but I mean, naming whatever you name things, right? It's in biology, the word gene has had a lot of different meanings over the years, and people didn't choose a new name for it. Yeah. And so you can, you know, of course, there's no problem in saying we call our community journal of X. That's not a problem. And you could even get you could even base that community on prestige. You could even have something like a nature or a science service on top of this sort of infrastructure if there would be a demand for it, because then you could actually have competition. That's actually a neat idea, because right now we don't know all the things that nature and science and so on rejected. But if you want to compare such services, that's what you need. You need the false positive rate, the false negative rate, and how many positives they got and how many negatives they got. So the true positive, the true negative, and the false positive and the false negative. So if you build a system where you have services that you can compare all four, you can actually have actual competition, because they can pick the same paper and say, yes, this is a really breakthrough. You don't say, oh, I got it, but you didn't, like now. So they go and say, okay, this is really the most important research. And then every year you can say, okay, you got so many, but you missed so many. You picked so many wrong ones, and you missed, and you missed so many ones that those that were wrong, and you missed those are actually good, right? So here you were correct, here you were wrong, and then you can compare them. Right now you cannot, because it's exclusive. So there's a lot of potential for, if you still want to call that sort of stuff journal, that's fine, right? But it has very little to do what is a journal today. But what we call a gene today is also radically different than what Gregor Mendel in the 19th century would have called a gene. So it's, if you know, and like I said, preprints is the same thing. I mean, the name is absurd, but we still use it. And so human language does not always have to make sense. So you can use journal for that sort of thing.
Okay, so the question was if this kind of definition of a journal fits within your model, which I think it does, because at least as a stepping stone to something more broad and more.
As a biologist, I'm used to change the definition of things. I have no problems with that.
And the other question, like very briefly, to the audience, to the repository community, because if it is realistic to offer this kind of infrastructure that Björn is discussing, because, for example, you asked if we know what's the software in the email server of a university. In our case, unfortunately, one of the biggest institutions in Spain, maybe the biggest in terms of faculty and students, it's Gmail, and it's a Google Suite, and we also use Microsoft Suite. So you said that publishers themselves, they want to take care of the entire research. So how realistic is that we eventually, institutional repositories and other public infrastructure can compete with the services that they already offer? Because Mendeley is what they suggest to us to use as reference manager. So it's not just publication.
It's already there, right? The whole
exactly.
vertical integration is already happening.
No,
it's already there.
It's happening. Yes. So we're talking about offering an alternative which is not commercial, which is, and I see this because now that we have this experiment going on with this journal, I'm seeing now the practical difficulties in trying to implementing new things that we need for this use case on the DSpace, for example, repository. And it's Isabel is trying to explain me how hard it is to make even small adjustments. And so I'm wondering if this is something that is very far away from a realistic plan, to offer something that is really attractive compared to the solutions that are already being provided by commercial companies. That's, I wonder whether it's.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think email is a good example, because everything is half as bad if you can switch, right? So if people think using Gmail for email becomes untenable, then you can switch, right? So you can go back to some other provider without too many changes. It's possible. That they do it is, deplorable, but in the end, it's a matter of faculty deciding what's more important. And so if that's the case, then I see no principal issue with that. So what does that mean for our infrastructure? Our infrastructure needs to be constructed in a way that switching providers remains easy, such that if there is an infrastructure provider that turns out after a few years, oh no, they do stuff that we don't want them to do, then you can switch. And so for Google, for instance, what is possible to do is when you hold the tender for email or whatever competition your institution has employed, you can write there that no, usage data cannot be used outside. Like, so you can use your own servers, but you have to provide us with access to the information of where which data is going. And then if this is not tenable for Google, because that's their business model, well, then they will not bid. And so, and if this is not important, if the institution doesn't care about user data, well, then that's how it is. And we are our institutions. And if we are a minority, if everyone at our institution doesn't care about user data, but you do, well, then this is not your institution. You should not be there. And then, this is just one aspect. There are many institutions that I would like to go to, and then there are other institutions that I don't want to work at for all kinds of reasons. And if providers are substitutable, then there's a possibility to do just that. And I think that's an important step ahead. Now, one could think about, and I think that's where it becomes unrealistic, but there are, at least in the online discussion, more and more people. I had a poll, of course, a Twitter poll, which of course says nothing. But I asked them, should for-profit organizations be completely banned from our public scientific scholarly infrastructure? And a huge majority said yes. Right? It's not representative. It's just a couple hundred people from Twitter. But even in these circles, there is a push towards preventing any commercial entities whatsoever. If you can switch, if you have control over your infrastructure, you can do that. And then you have the regular decision-making processes that we have. But right now, we can't even make that decision. Because right now, we don't own the infrastructure. It's the corporations that own them. So it's a moot point at this point in time.
Thanks, Björn. I'm going to suggest that we just finish with the questions from Ginny online, and Irina and Gultikan, you can follow up with Björn. Okay, it was covered already, and Gultikan, you can discuss at the coffee break with with Björn. So Jenny, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, hi there. Can you hear me all okay?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So hello everybody, I'm Ginny, I'm Barbara, I work for Open Access Australasia, I'm based in Australia. So I think maybe my question or comment follows on from the previous one about the role of journals. So as many of you might know, I used to work at Public Library of Science, so I was one of the editors at PLOS Medicine, worked in Europe, and I now work in Australia. And one of the things I've become increasingly convinced about is the importance of local journals and of very kind of quite niche journals, particularly for, say, in this region, for Indigenous research. And now a lot of this is humanities, but I'm just really interested, Bjorn, in kind of what your thoughts are about how we don't lose that richness as we move to your kind of vision, which I find incredibly appealing, and I would love to see us be, chucking out most of the journals. But I do really recognise there are some very important kind of features that we need to not lose. Thanks.
No, I absolutely agree. I don't have, from what little insight I have into fields outside of the natural sciences, everything tells me that that's why I made that caveat earlier today as well, that everything there in a lot of areas seems to be a lot more centered around the community itself. And this lies probably a little bit also in the more historic structure of the hermeneutic, if you want, sciences, right? Of the where you sort of say, oh, X, Y, and Z wrote back then this, and then I'm going to interpret that. And so communities build around schools of thought. And so these, and then you have, of course, you have local research that is important for local and regional aspects. And that could actually also be scientific aspects with regard to climate change, obviously, pollution, these sorts of things, but also sociological research if it has to do with indigenous people and or political aspects that are of local or regional relevance. And so one aspect of that we talked about actually at coffee before the meeting started this morning is that if institutions don't outsource everything like email to Gmail, if they don't, it means that they retain local expertise. And that is actually very relevant also for me as a scientist who does not need any local journals. But for me as a user and everyone who spent any amount of time in a waiting list on a call center knows the value of local support. And so, of course, for that, the idea of a decentralized system where libraries are the custodians of this part of the infrastructure, of course, that I'm sorry, I'm confused because I want to look you in the face, but I'm realizing that the camera is probably somewhere else. The importance of local support is actually broad across the field, because it may be technical support on one end, but it may be really local and more than technical and substantial content support in other areas. And that would be maintained if there would be a degree of decentralization. Now, I have to say, I've heard that in Europe, there is a push towards a more centralized approach. Now, I don't know how much of that, well, I do know that this is currently just ideas. There's nothing implemented. There's no plan, but there's ideas to have a centralized infrastructure for all of this. And I would say that this would save institutions a lot of money if, let's say, the European Commission would pay for all of this, but this would come with some drawbacks. And so I would hope that should these ideas, really vague ideas that I've heard, materialize, I would still hope that local support would still be possible. And I think local support is crucial for a lot of reasons. These things are not trivial. At least maybe in 30 years they'll be trivial, but until I retire, they will remain non-trivial. I'm fairly sure about that. And for that, local support is crucial. And I think as long as we have local support, then these communities that you talked about, they should also be well served, if not better served, right? If much of the money that today goes to international cooperation stays with the institution and is spent locally, it just means that it's also spent locally on full-time equivalents, which means there should be more support for these communities than there is now, hopefully.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you so much, Bjorn. What an excellent talk. Great questions. And we really appreciate you taking the time to come and spend the day with us. So let's give another hand to Bjorn.
Thank you.